Rodriguez to you today. Towards the end of his 1982 memoir, Hunger of Memory, The Education of Richard Rodriguez, he describes the lesson he has learned in writing about his family, his childhood and youth, and the Catholic Church he grew up in. Quote, I have come to think that there is a place for the deeply personal in public life. There are things so deeply personal that they can be revealed only to strangers. I believe this. I continue to write. For this, we should all be grateful. Over the ensuing decades, in his books such as Days of Obligation, An Argument with My Mexican Father, Brown, The Last Discovery of America, and Darling, a spiritual autobiography, as well as in essays such as those he's contributed to PBS's NewsHour, Richard Rodriguez has invited strangers into his ruminations on everything from bilingual education and sexual identity to color, class, and ethnicity, to his faith and his church. He rejects the compartmentalization of human experience that reduces people to labels like gay or feminist. He refuses to ally himself with any of the conventional adversarial factions of traditional versus progressive, conservative versus liberal. In a time where data and slogans pass for understanding, Rodriguez explores the subterranean paradoxes of the psyche. He can do this because he holds, simultaneously, multiple worldviews and multiple identities, and continually seeks deeper understanding of himself and of his world and of his God. He does this through continually reimagining himself in the world in which he lives. Now, the imagination is a mysterious process, bringing unconscious elements into consciousness, making a meaningful whole of sensations, language, memory, perceptions. And the imagination is not only a path towards self-discovery. As the writer John Cornwell puts it, our very souls arise through the gift and the exercise of our imagination. When we read of the faith world of Rodriguez's family, of his reverence for the wisdom of women, of his quest for God in the desert from which our tradition came, we witness his soul arising. Still, we are all here in the flesh. And as Rodriguez says in Darling, the flesh is a complicated medium for grace. We Catholics are wandering in a desert these days, and our faith needs refreshment. We need to set aside needless divisions, to be courageous in revealing ourselves to each other, to make our way forward with unfettered imagination and with grace. In Richard Rodriguez, we have a worthy guide.
Thank you, Catherine, very much. I have to say first, truly, my thanks to the organizers of this conference for their invitation. I thank them especially after asking whether I could speak in one of my true voices as a gay Catholic, as a paradox to myself, as someone who has loved the same man for almost 40 years, and is told by the church that I love that it is not love that I feel toward him at 3 a.m, but vanity. The complexity of that, to be in love with a church that tells me I do not know what love is something of what I want to tell you today. I know a woman who is another writer. She writes of religion, and she wrote a very good biography of the Prophet Muhammad. There was a literary book festival on the West Coast at a Catholic university, Nameless. And she suggested to the priest, Nameless, that I be invited to that book fair. This was 3 years ago. And he very sweetly said to her, "It's not the right time." Ladies and gentlemen, it is now 11:29 Central Daylight Time. It is such a wonderful gift to talk about writers, but oddly enough, I'm such a contrarian that I think that I don't want to talk about writers so much. as painters, that the great tradition of Catholicism seems to me to be more visual than it is literary. I will get back to that point later. I remember thinking in college that the Catholic novels that I read, and I read so many of them, puzzled me because the novel has always seemed to me a Protestant genre to come out of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And I always thought if you wanted to talk about a Catholic genre, you would be talking about grand opera. You'd be talking about Ella Fitzgerald. You'd be talking about this man in late middle age talking about being gay at a time when it doesn't matter to much of America, but it matters a great deal to him and to his church. I'm an essayist. I'm not a novelist. I don't know whether I think of myself as a Catholic essayist. I certainly think of myself as a Jewish essayist, insofar as I would not have any literary career were it not for Jews who found my talent and accepted it. My first editor, Bill Goodman, who I'm going to say this now, even though my partner who is here will tell me later I should not have said this, but Bill Goodman was so angry at a review that my first book got in Commonweal that he wanted to write a letter of protest. And the reviewer was, curiously enough, a woman from this university, a Latina, who was just so angry at me for my betrayal of my Mexican ancestry. Bill said to me, he said, "This is not what Commonweal was to me in the 1950s. And I said, "Let it go, Bill." He said, "I can't let it go. The standards of literary criticism are dying in America." I would not be standing here without Bill Goodman, without Mike Saltz, who was my producer on the NewsHour, without the critics who praised my work at a time when no one else was praising it. Jews, secular Jews, who had been raised with this hunger for words, this talent for language, and who whether or not I was a Catholic was the least of it for them. What I was is a writer for them. So if you want to know that if I'm a Catholic Jew. If you want to know about the Catholic part, you should have spoken to the little boy at about the age of 10, who was on his way after arithmetic class. He was excused from arithmetic class to go to a funeral for an old woman at the church, which was 1 block away, beautiful Sacred Heart Church. He would have told you that he felt himself very lucky to be an American. It was a fortunate chance of his life. His Mexican father kept telling him the same thing. And that to live in a society where it was a right to pursue happiness was an extraordinary opportunity. What he would tell you also, of course, is that the Catholic in him was skeptical of exactly that right. As he walked toward the church, he would tell you that the church gave him a kind of density of mystery that he found nowhere else, not in Walt Disney, not in Elvis Presley, not on the Ed Sullivan Show, a density of mystery to our lives, which would nowhere be found except within that extraordinary building that he was going to, Sacred Heart Church. I was a boy by at that time with a sexual secret. It is true. And at the cemetery, I remember, for that old lady at her funeral, I remember in the distance a Stanley Spencer painting. There was a young man, shirtless, getting out of a grave, like resurrection. And my eyes saw him. My eyes saw beauty resurrecting itself. I attended to the moment. I attended to the fact that Father Cormac needed the holy water to spray on the old woman's coffin. And I gave him the pail. But I saw also the man in the distance. I want to tell you something about the altar boy and what he saw one Easter. It was in the space between the Easter Vigil, which is a particularly wonderful liturgy, and the midnight mass on Easter in Sacred Heart Church. He was assigned, with several other boys, the job of lighting the bank of candles And suddenly, after Lent, the altar was awash with white flowers, and this assurance that Christ was resurrected. And the purple claws were removed from the statues, and we were about to begin the great liturgy of joy. And what the boys saw was that Christ was still hanging on the cross. It was right over the tabernacle. He was still there. It was still Good Friday on Easter Sunday morning. He was still there. Did no one else see it? He was hanging over the altar. Nothing had changed. He was looking out at us in the pews because we were on the far side of resurrection. And he was sharing in that view of us the experience of being still waiting for resurrection. So many times when I go to colleges, there is always a woman, it's always a woman, who will ask me after my speech. She will always say something about being lonely. And it's usually about being lonely in America because I have this brown face and this Aztec nose and these oversized lips. She'll say it must have been very lonely to do. It happened in Dallas, Texas. It happened in Las Vegas one morning with the sound of slot machines in the distance. It happened just a few months ago at Ohio State in Columbus. The woman said, lonely again. And then she said, gay. She wasn't talking about being brown, being Mexican, looking like an Aztec. She used the word gay. And I thought to myself, well, was I lonely as a gay boy in Sacramento, California? And I'm not sure that I was. Now, at the high school that I attended, Christian Brothers High School, there's a gay club. So far have we advanced. But I'm not sure I would join it. I like my solitude. I like making peace with loneliness. It's the most essential thing for students to learn. Any student in this room is make your peace with loneliness. It's something that no one will teach you. It comes to you as a kind of wisdom, the ability to take solitude as part of your life. A gay club. What would I do at a gay club? I remember on junior prom night, I did not inflict my dancing skills on a young girl and give her a carnation corsage. I went to hear Malcolm X. That's what I did with my loneliness. I don't know what, I look back now and I think to myself, my parents were crazy with the freedom they gave me, not my sisters. The freedom they gave me to have Sacramento. I don't know what Joan Didion was doing in those years, but I was wandering everywhere. I went to hear a John Birch Society meeting at the Senator Hotel, just because. Joan Didion's mother, by the way, was a member of the John Birch Society. There was a boy with an oversized heart, Billy Reckers. I love speaking his name in public today. Lost so many years ago, an oversized heart. And he used to love jazz. He taught me Frank Sinatra, how to listen to Frank Sinatra. We went to see Cal Tjader, Dave Brubeck. Lonely. On Monday night, there was wrestling at the Memorial Auditorium. Lonely? Broadway shows used to come through. These were third company traveling shows. And of course, like a gay boy, I love chorus boys. And I loved the glitter. And I loved the impossible love they could sing, even though the chorus boy would never sing that song. Lonely. There was one night at the Memorial Auditorium on Tuesday, they had boxing, and there was a boxer named Bobby Chacon, who was a featherweight boxer, a championship featherweight boxer. What I did not know that night, in a room of maybe 5,000 Mexican farm workers, braceros we called them in those days, who were standing for the entire match. What I did not know that night is that his wife, Bobby Chacon's wife, had committed suicide the previous night in their trailer. because he would not stop fighting. And there he was, entering the ring to the cheer of all of these Mexicans. And he, irony of irony, dedicated the match to his wife, to the memory of his wife. The match lasted for 3 rounds. It was furious. The snap of leather on skin is like nothing else. And the blood and the sweat went across the ring, and the men cheered, and Bobby Chacon won. But that's not what I want to tell you. I was close enough to the aisle so that I saw him leaving the ring, everyone tapping him on the shoulder and congratulating him for the match. I saw his face, Bobby Chacon's face. It was swollen a bit, and there were some cuts and some bruises, this victor. But I could not tell whether he was smiling or crying. What I want to tell you is that I've seen that face throughout Latin America. It's the face of Christ. It's the face of Christ on the cross. And wherever there are Indians in Latin America, in Peru, in Guatemala, in Mexico, they look at that face for hours. It is somehow a face that touches them in a way that no other face in our society touches them. The face of Bobby Chacon. I have a friend who's a bank robber, and he would like me to mention his name, because he's a self-advertising bank robber. His name is Joe Loya. I wrote the introduction to his memoir. He has a memoir of being a bank robber, and I wrote the introduction. It's called, my essay is called Parole. Joe is an atheist, though his father was an evangelical minister. Maybe that's why he's an atheist, because he's at war with his father, with the memory of his father. And he is also scornful toward my Catholicism. And he has great affection for Christopher Hitchens. He thinks Christopher Hitchens was the great, despite the Iraq War, Christopher Hitchens was the great voice of atheism in the America that he grew up in. Anyway, we're sitting in my nephew's Mexican restaurant in Oakland. And Joe, as we begin to eat, gets the idea of asking me what he knows the answer is. He asks me if I know the Bible. And he says, you Catholics don't know the Bible. And I said, oh, well, we sort of do. We know the stories. And Joe starts quoting lines while I'm dipping the chip into the guacamole. He says, where's that from? And I say, Job. And I said, no, it's not from Job. I said, well, give me a clue. Is it New Testament or Old Testament? And he says, New. I said, Book of Revelations, another chip into the guacamole. One of the things to say at a conference given to a literary consideration of Catholics is how little we know the Bible, how little it comes up. I didn't read the Bible seriously until I was in college. I remember telling Sister Damien in 8th grade that I was going to, because I was a kind of preening scholarship boy, that I was going to, instead of reading all of Dickens one summer, I was going to read the Bible. And she turned so pale with worry. She said, wait till we read it together. I read Catholic novels. I read Evelyn Waugh. I read George Bernanos. I read J.F. Powers. Wonderful stories of priests in J.F. Powers. Wonderful, funny, sad, domestic comedy. I read Francois Mauriac, someone who nobody really mentions anymore, a book called Viper's Tangle. It's really about the difficulty of hating. I love Catholic novels because they were always twisted like this. A Protestant novel might talk about the importance of loving. Mauriac talked about the difficulty of hating, how much energy it takes to hate someone. And here is this old man from the grave who has left this letter to his terrible children and grandchildren, and he can't hate them anymore. It takes too much strength, it's too much energy, it takes too much concentration, and he's dead. I knew that. I knew the Catholic novels. I knew what Catholicism sounded like as a novel, but I didn't know the Bible. There were American writers, I remember, who I thought to myself I could hear a biblical cadence in their prose. Curiously enough, Mark Twain, who apparently would read to his family from the Bible with great effect. There it was, you could hear it in his prose. Abraham Lincoln, of course, but Faulkner too. It was in so many Southern writers, this biblical cadence. I don't associate that with Flannery O'Connor, though she was able, as a Catholic mimic, to hear the voice of circus tent Protestants. And what a mimic she was. What I didn't tell Joe Lloyd, bank robber, is that I didn't know where that line was from in the Bible. But my favorite hymn as a boy was De Tantum Ergo, and that I was let out of school many mornings to serve at the funerals for old people. And I lifted the old lady's coffin as we went to the open grave. I knew the weight of death. And I had seen the face of Jesus. That's what Catholicism gave me. It was so sensual a religion. Gay, non-gay. It was so sensual. Of course this gay little boy would be entranced by it. The ceremony, the incense, the candles, the glitter. It was like a Broadway musical. There was this, here's a Mary McCarthy story. Mary McCarthy, angry at Catholicism, angry at her Catholic childhood, her Catholic girlhood. I had a pastor, my beloved pastor in 5th grade, said to us in 5th grade that we must not look too long at our bodies when we take baths. Just scrub and get out. This was the same pastor, though, who during the Depression, a wealthy parishioner had left the church a large amount of money for a new church. Harry Devine, who was then in Sacramento the architect for churches, Catholic churches, gave the Monsignor a plan for a new church, and the Monsignor said, it's not good enough. Go back. Give us something to remember. And he gave us at 39th and J Street, Sacred Heart Church, this beautiful Romanesque church. It is something. I have written on other occasions that the only building in Sacramento that came close to it in magic and mystery was the Alhambra movie theater. And they tore down the Alhambra theater for a safe way, but Sacred Heart Church is still there. What that church understands, that building understands, what that architecture understands, is that we pray to God within shadow, under glass, colored glass, within the majesty of an architecture that keeps moving us forward. So there was my Mary McCarthy story. How could I not be enchanted by the Catholic Church? Secret or no secret. I remember in those days, the last days of the Latin Mass, holding the paten under your chin at the communion as you knelt on the altar at the altar rail, and how your tongues came out like little lizard tongues. Sometimes nervous, darting out. Sometimes nervous, with a kind of anxiety. The eyes sometimes fluttering, like a lover's eyes. Your head held back. Sometimes creamy tongues because you had fasted since the night before. And I thought to myself, these people are eating Jesus. They are taking Jesus, and he is a taste. And if they keep the taste in, they keep the wafer long enough in their mouths, he will melt in their mouths like a wafer, like chocolate candy. My goodness. Tell me about being gay. It was the most sensual part of my life to be in that church. And then it was gone. I date the election of Jack Kennedy as the end of the Catholic Church that I was raised in. I think what the Kennedys achieved, not nobly, was that suddenly Catholics were no longer foreign in America. We were recognizable in America. I was at a conference in Dallas a couple of years ago on I think the 50th anniversary of the assassination. It's the first time Dallas, the city of Dallas, has had any commemoration of that assassination, amazingly. And there was a woman who, in the conference on religion, who said, that was the first time, watching that funeral from the National Cathedral, was the first time that I had seen a Catholic Mass. How beautiful it is, how consoling it is. And I understood it for the first time. And I thought to myself, how wonderful that is. But in the process of making ourselves recognizable to them, we cease to be recognizable to ourselves. We cease to be as exotic as we used to be to ourselves. And the new architecture of the churches, the suburban architecture, circle in the round, the Joan Baez songbook, these statues that look like they were done by someone under the influence of at least, shall I say, an overripe imagination. And it was in the years that I was in college and beyond that Catholicism still remained, but not so much within the church, but outside the church, with figures like Martin Scorsese, for example, the seminarian who, after 1 year, decided to become a filmmaker, and did films in which people slashed each other under the chin, buried each other alive. And I thought to myself, how Catholic is that? Francis Ford Coppola, the three Godfather films, the least successful is the most Catholic one. That is, they all end up in the Vatican. Or Madonna. No one's going to mention Madonna. I'll mention Madonna today. The Virgin Mary from Detroit. There she was, and she could play at blasphemy because there was still such a thing in America as blasphemy. And now she's so long in the tooth, and we're so beyond blasphemy that we can't play with the Catholic imagery anymore. I think the last of the secular saints from those years was Andy Warhol for me. There is, by the way, an exhibit of Andy Warhol at the Vatican that's being mounted. Either it's there now or it's about to be opened. I thought to myself, a black man, who used to go to Mass on Lexington Avenue, living with his mother on the Upper East Side, and going down to the factory, his studio, and the socialites and the drug addicts and the street people and the celebrities whose faces you know, who have nothing to say but are the most famous people in the world. There he was with his silkscreens. And my favorite one, of course, is of the Virgin Mary, Marilyn Monroe. That Marilyn Monroe series, where she looks at us, the way those icons that he grew up with in his Ukrainian, in his Catholic church in Pittsburgh, the rows and rows of icons he saw as a boy in Pittsburgh. Now the Virgin Mary stares at us. Now Marilyn Monroe stares at us with completely empty eyes and a face that tells us what it cost to become the most famous sex base in America. And what is worse, of course, is the carnival colors behind her. You can get Marilyn in any color you want. She's like a circus clown. Saint Andy Warhol, pray for us. I need to say something about the sexual scandals of the last decades, about priests who have assaulted altar boys, about bishops who have assaulted pretty seminarians, about cardinals chasing after whomever. Before they were removed from office, before their powers as priests were removed, before we knew their secret, they were truly priests. This is our faith as Catholics, and it drives Protestants out of their minds. Because what we also say is the decadent Renaissance Pope who was married to his daughter was a true Pope. Not because of him, but because of the grace of Jesus that filled his life, so that the sinful priest could baptize, could confess, could change the wafer into the body of Christ, hoc est enum corpus meum. And we swallowed it. Could put oils on our grandmother's forehead when she was dying. When we found out that they were sinners, we didn't ask for our money back. We didn't say, oh, we're going to have to be baptized again. What we knew is that we had been baptized by the sinner. It's the most remarkable thing about our faith, how the grace of God overwhelms our failures. Point number one, the fallen priest. As these stories have emerged, particularly after Pennsylvania, the horror stories in Pennsylvania, in the newspaper or on the 7 o'clock news, it bothers me excessively that we know so little about these priests. We've so rarely heard their stories. We don't know their stories. Who were they? What did they think they were doing? Catholic imagination, have we any imagination of any of that? They're gone now. In jail, in Colombia, in Ireland, in Mexico. We have no idea what they were, who they were, what they suffered, what they knew, what their sorrow was, what their pleasure was. I have a friend, a very good friend, who's a Catholic priest, a very good man, who was a priest about that same time that many of these priests were. In fact, he was a seminarian in a minor seminary in the 1960s. And he tells me that there was absolutely no mention of sex in the seminary. And I said to him, well, there was no mention of sex in the high schools I went to. He said, but we were expected to be celibate in our lives. And it was never mentioned. Never mentioned that we had bodies, what to expect of our bodies, why our sheets were soiled at night. The German nuns at the Gregorian would come and clean the sheets. And the next day you would have clean sheets. Our imaginations have gone dull as Catholics. We might as well be Puritans. We know nothing about the bodies of the fallen priests. We know nothing about their souls. I can tell you stories. I don't have time to tell you stories. I can tell you one story about an old priest who ended up in jail. The worst thing to be is a child molester in jail, because among the criminals, it is the worst of crimes. It is the inner circle of hell. But he's become a priest in prison. The prisoners have come to them, and he says, I can't confess your sins. Listen to my sins. Pray for me. He has become a priest, a fallen priest. I think the only writer who I know about who could tell such a story was Graham Greene, who when I was a boy told the story of Mexico, revolutionary Mexico, where the Marxist government in Mexico City decided to outlaw Catholicism, closed the churches, closed the convents, chased the priests from the streets. And there is one priest in the village who remains, the whiskey priest. And he's drunk when he says the words of consecration, breathing his alcoholic breath onto the chalice. And his hand shakes with the chalice. He's the last one left. Catholic imagination. I know lots of other stories. I'll tell you some other time. I want to tell you a real story. And I'm not going to... I've debated all night about whether I would name him. I'm going to name him. His name was Virgilio. And he lived in San Antonio. And he was a great priest. And he's dead, as some of you know. He was a great liturgist, and he taught me a great deal on a number of occasions that I spent with him, learning about Mexican Catholicism. He believed that the great wave of Catholicism was coming from the South. Not from France, as Flannery O'Connor would have it, but from the South. That Spain will be a larger factor in our imaginations in the near future. And Africa, of course. But Spanish Catholicism coming out of Latin America, of course, this Latin American Pope that we have now, who's the beginning of this new civilization in the church. But Virgilio was a very generous man, and he would spend the entire day with me. And we corresponded over the years when I needed some advice about how to understand some point of Catholicism, Mexican Catholicism. And he wrote immediately to me. Always that same magnanimous, buoyant energy as a big man. He was a big man, commuting between Notre Dame and San Antonio. And then I heard a rumor. A lot of people heard a rumor in San Antonio that some accusation was being made against him from years past. Something he did, something he touched, or we didn't know. No one knew. I was on C-SPAN with him one day. This was toward the end. I saw him in the green room. I was advertising my book, and a writer advertising a book in a society that doesn't read knows neurosis. I had 24 minutes on screen, and I had to talk and do, here's the book, and he'd agreed to come and interview me on television from the San Antonio Library. But it wasn't him. He looked so beaten, so crestfallen, so sad. We shook hands, we went out and we did the interview. The last thing I remember him saying on my left was, "The love of Jesus." But I had no place for that in what I was talking about. I was talking about women and religion, in the desert religions, women in the desert religion, the love of Jesus. I went up to the podium and I started reading from my book. 8 minutes, that's what I had at the podium. Finished, thanked him for coming, he disappears. A few months later, in his house in San Antonio, he puts a rifle either under his chin or in his mouth. That is not the end of the story. The end of the story is his funeral. There was a funeral mass at the cathedral. And there were lines and lines of priests and nuns. You might expect them to be there. But what you did not expect was how many people from San Antonio came. I mean, grandmothers who brought their grandchildren. I mean, young women who had taken off from work. It was a Mexican funeral, I will tell you. The church was crowded with them and their singing. And we were claiming him. He was ours. We were not putting him away. I went to a noonday mass recently. Sometimes when my writing goes very badly or goes very well, when I'm finished about 11:30, I go to the cathedral. San Francisco is a dreadful building. It was the first cathedral built after the Vatican Council. It's circling around, and it's not very good, and it's drafty and ugly. And noonday mass usually, there used to be about 200 people who went to noonday mass. Since the scandals, there are about 20 people there. Old Chinese women, Filipinos, and the Mexican kid from Sacramento who's no longer 10 years old. Me. And there was an Indian priest at saying Mass that day, and he said the most extraordinary thing about about Christ's commandments, the two great commandments. The first one was easy, he said. It's the second one that gives me pause, he said. Love your neighbor as yourself, he said. Do you know what that means? He says most people don't love themselves. That's the problem. Have you seen her wrist where she's been cutting herself? Have you seen the pills on grandmother's shelf, the pills she takes to go to sleep at night? Have you seen the way we look in the mirror looking for the mirror to flatter us? And it doesn't. Most people don't love themselves. How does he know this, I think to myself? We don't know anything about him. How does he know about us? From hearing our confessions. I beat my wife. I hate my children. I steal from my boss. And I hate myself for it, but I cannot stop because I'm a gambler. How does he know about us to know that we don't love ourselves? And we know nothing about him because we don't have Catholic imaginations. We get our imaginations from Oprah Winfrey or from somewhere, but they're not Catholic. So dull we are. In preparing these remarks, I did what every student at Loyola does, and I went on Google. And I looked up famous homosexuals. And I found a list that begins with Michelangelo and ends with Ellen DeGeneres. I have nothing to tell you about Ellen DeGeneres, but Michelangelo is interesting. Because no one that I have ever heard in a Catholic church has ever remarked on the possibility that there is a gay sensibility in the Vatican that has designed the Sistine Chapel, under which the door bishops and cardinals wander. And no one has ever appraised, as to my knowledge, the Pietà as gay art. And there is, in the Church of Santa Maria del Spirito Santo in Florence, a naked Jesus, a crucifix, that is as fine a crucifix as has ever been carved in the world. It was designed by Michelangelo as a young man from the dead bodies he had seen at a hospital in Florence. And it looks like the men that I have seen and that I helped die with morphine during the AIDS years. There's no sense that we have lived in the church. There's no sense that gay Catholics come along and sing as though we've just arrived. Francis Cardinal Newman is to be canonized next month on October 13th. I will see you in Rome. But when his canonization looked like it was advancing, Pope Benedict got worried. What do we do about Cardinal Newman? Because it turned out that the great love of his life, that was the phrase he used, was another priest, Ambrose St. James. And he asked to be buried in the same coffin with this man, the true love of my life. And so their bodies were gathered together in the coffin. Well, that would not do. Canonization, we need to bring his body to be venerated in Rome. We need bones and parts of his hair to be given out as relics. They unearthed the grave, and it turned out that lime had been scattered on the grave. And when they opened the casket, there were no bones. Newman got the last laugh. He disappeared. And it is left to us on October 13th to venerate and to pray to St. John Newman. We don't want to know anything. We don't want to know who he was buried with. We don't want to know what the Sistine Chapel represents in the gay imagination. It's as though we deliberately have decided not to have imaginations. Let's not imagine any of it. I know a number of priests who are gay, though they probably wouldn't, well, maybe some of them do. They're celibate. They live very quietly. Estimates are that from 15 to 50% of American priests are gay. What does that mean? Well, most people say, well, they went into the priesthood to sort of avoid their sexuality. Or they went into the priesthood to get their mother's approval without the shame of being gay. Well, maybe. But maybe their homosexuality was a spiritual gift. The way heterosexuality is a gift. Maybe it made them better priests. Well, my friend Steve, with whom I have a lunch every Christmas week, says, well, I can imagine they might want to get rid of us. This cleansing is coming down in America. Steve Bannon is going to come through with his troops, and Donald Trump behind them, the great warriors of the Christian tradition. And they're going to cast us aside. I was referred to in a Catholic magazine in Chicago, a right-wing Catholic magazine, as being effete. And I think they're going to look for every effete Catholic they can find and cast us into the sea. But I think to myself, Steve says, if they do that, the parish where there are 2 masses now, there's going to be 1. The line that takes 30 minutes to get through for confession is going to take you an hour. And when you call the rectory because your grandfather is dying, no one will answer. Pope Benedict put on his slippers the other day, his papal slippers, and broke his silence. He said that he was retiring from being a pope. But he came out and said rather angrily that he blamed the gay movement of the 1970s for the sexual excess in the priesthood. That I was to blame. That my friends and I, we'd come out, whether it's Stonewall or wherever it was, and we had broken the barrier. Speaking for myself, I have always credited the suffragettes of the 19th century from my coming out of the closet. Something happened in the 19th century that freed me. Women, as they say, coming out of the kitchen, let me come out of the closet, these domestic metaphors we use. Something happens in the streets of Europe in the 19th century. Women usually dressed in black, marching down the street. If they were arrested, they were force-fed because they were on hunger strikes, insisting on the right to the vote. To say in private, in public, that I want this or I don't want that, regardless of what my husband thinks, regardless of what my father might say of this, I have my voice in the public society. It is the beginning of an idea which now is advancing around the world. Women are now driving without the company of men in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia today. It is the beginning of this idea that women do not have to depend on men for their public life. It was my beginning. The idea that I could live free of my family's judgment. And my father was not pleased, my Mexican father was not pleased when I told him shortly before he died. I didn't use the word gay, but he knew. My freedom was the suffragettes. In 2012, the Vatican was censorious toward American nuns because there was this sudden realization in Rome made between feminism and homosexuality, that they were linked somehow. And Cardinal Leveda, actually, who was a friend of mine, or at least he was the only Archbishop of San Francisco who'd ever invited me to dinner, who ever asked me my opinions on anything. We talked about Latin America over dinner. But Leveda, as cardinal, issued this letter to American nuns, criticizing them for being soft on homosexuality and on women's reproductive rights, reproduction. There was a blowback in the world because at a time in which the priesthood and cardinals and bishops were under fire for their failures. Suddenly to go after nuns seemed outrageous. So he backed off. If I were Pope Francis today, I would decide that it's not going to happen in my papacy that there will be a determination on married priests, certainly not women priests. But what I would decide as a crafty Latin American is to name women as cardinals. It can be done. You do not need to be a bishop to be a cardinal. You do not need to be a priest to be a cardinal. You could be a cardinal. And to have a group of women in the Sistine Chapel deciding who the next pope is gives me more joy and more optimism than having a group of these doddering old men. Women are going to write this century. They are writing the 21st century. The novels that we are going to read, which we will call Catholic novels, will be written by women. And the imagination of the criminal priest will be written by a woman. It is clear to me that something very large is happening, and the church doesn't know what to do about it. Except maybe to have a woman on the altar working as a server on the altar, and to have girls instead of altar boys. This is the woman's century. And in conclusion, I just want to say about the women who educated me, the Sisters of Mercy, the Irish Order, who gave me my voice, gave me this tongue, gave me my confidence in America, America that I didn't reject, but was always second to the mystery of suffering. America told me I could be happy if I had the right to be happy. I trusted the church who told me that suffering was at the center of our human experience and that no pill could we take that would avoid that suffering, that all wisdom lived in that suffering and all growth as a human being. If you accept suffering, you accept your humanity. The Sisters of Mercy taught me. I am aware of the scandal that attaches to that order in Ireland. The stories of sadism, that's no other words for it, sadism against girls in homes for unwed mothers, cruelties. These were not the women who educated me. They had come to America, they'd come to San Francisco in the 19th century, just after the gold rush. They were not wanted in San Francisco just after the gold rush. No one knew what to make of them, these women who were wandering the streets looking like Arabs. They were dressed in full black. You couldn't see their arms, you couldn't see their shoulders, you couldn't see their necks. And they covered their hair. And San Francisco called them whores. They had no place to sleep the first weeks that they were in San Francisco. They slept at the back in the vestibule of St. Patrick's Church. And then the city needed them. There was a smallpox epidemic, and those women ministered to the young men who were dying of smallpox. And then the women who were getting venereal disease as whores were ministered to by these women. And then there was an earthquake. And then the nuns set up a tent city in the Presidio. There is a monument to the Sisters of Mercy at the northern entrance to the state capitol. They are heroes in California. The women who educate, they are historical heroes, my teachers. A century or so after that first contingent of Irish nuns came, I was educated, and I moved away from them and became a writer in America, for whatever that means. But maybe a year before she died, my second grade teacher, with the wonderful name of Sister Mary Ackwin, wrote to me. I will share to you what she said. She said in that wonderful, florid nun's hand, which they never lose, even as they are dying and their hand is shaking. She said it didn't matter to her that I was gay. I don't think she used the word gay. It didn't matter to her that I was homosexual, she said. I will pass along to you what she said next. Her counsel. Only love, she said. That's what I give you from Sister Mary Equin. Thank you very much.